Hello, and welcome to Group 6's presentation on Addison's disease.
To begin with, Addison's disease has many names. For example, adrenocortical insufficiency, primary adrenocortical insufficiency, or primary failure adrenocortical insufficiency. All these terms refer to the same thing: Addison's disease. Addison's disease is a disorder that occurs because of your body's inability to produce enough cortisol and aldosterone hormones in the adrenal glands. Cortisol hormones help regulate the response to stress. This includes any type of stress that can derive from injury, surgery, or illness. Maintaining stable levels of cortisol ensures a healthy heart, a balanced immune system, and blood glucose levels. Aldosterone hormones help balance how much sodium and potassium is in the blood, which in turn affects blood pressure. So, if Addison's disease is not being treated as it should be, then it can be dangerous or life-threatening. Now, moving on, the pictures shown. In the first picture, I wanted to show exactly where this all takes place, and this is above the kidney, but we will get more into that in the second slide. And the second picture that I put is a basic overview of Addison's disease. It goes more into depth of the ACTH, and then it's a little cartoon about a before and after of what a person might look like and what they might experience with weight loss, hyperpigmentation, weakness, and so on and so forth. To understand Addison's disease, we have to understand what the endocrine system is. So what is the endocrine system? The endocrine system is a set of glands that secrete hormones to help coordinate and control most processes of the body, including your metabolism, growth, mood, and sexual function, just to name a few. The hormones secreted by these organs send signals through your body and through your blood to your organs. Consequently, these messages tell your body subconsciously what to do and how to do it. The way these hormones send these messages is through binding themselves to receptors to transmit a signal. The glands that secrete the hormones are all over our bodies. The main glands of our bodies are the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, pineal, pancreatic, ovarian, and testes. The endocrine system is essential to our body's homeostasis, which is important for our survival. Without the endocrine system, your body would not function properly and would be detrimental to your overall development and health. In the PowerPoint, I added these two pictures. In the first one, it's a picture of the word Addison because of the Addison's disease, but each letter represents something that correlates to Addison's disease. For example, the A is the ACTH, D for the dark skin, the hyperpigmentation, which is one of the symptoms, salt cravings for the S, and then stress, and so on and so forth. And the second picture is part of the endocrine system, and it just shows how hormones are regulated. So going through the secretion vesicles, to the hormone molecules, the targeting cells inside the blood vessels, going in and out. And then we can also see that there are neurotransmitter molecules, but we should not confuse these with hormones because neurotransmitters are part of the nervous system, not the endocrine system. So, the adrenal glands are composed of two parts, the cortex and the medulla. Each handles the production of different hormones. The adrenal cortex is the outer region and the biggest part of the adrenal gland. This cortex has 3 separate sections that are each individually responsible for producing hormones. The medulla is found inside the cortex, producing stress hormones. The adrenal gland sits above the kidney, and inside there is a layer called the adipose capsule, which acts as a form of protection around the adrenal gland. The hypothalamus produces corticotropin releasing hormone, or otherwise known as CRH, that stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropin hormone, or otherwise known as ACTH. ACTH then stimulates the adrenal glands to make and release cortisol hormones, that is, into the blood. If there is too much or too little cortisol, these glands respectively change the amount of CRH and ACTH that gets released. This is referred to as a negative feedback loop. Excess cortisol production can occur from nodules in the adrenal gland or excess production of ACTH from a tumor in the pituitary gland or other sources. Aldosterone sends signals to the kidneys, resulting in the kidneys absorbing more sodium into the bloodstream and releasing potassium into the urine. This means that aldosterone also helps regulate the body and the blood pH by controlling the levels of electrolytes in the blood. Moving forward, we can look at the chemical level of organization. Now, cells communicate with each other through molecular messengers and hormones. The simple definition of a hormone as an intercellular messenger is much more inclusive than the original one, which limited the hormones to substances produced by specialized multicellular organisms, the glands, that circulate in the blood and act on distant target organs. So, Addison's disease comes from the chemical organization of the cells and hormones involved in the adrenal glands. Lack of production of the glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids characterizes Addison's disease. Most cases of Addison's disease occurs because the adrenal glands have been damaged and are no longer able to make cortisol and aldosterone, even when stimulated by the ACTH and the angiotensin number 2. Adrenal failure in the Addison's disease results in decreased cortisol production, initially followed by that of aldosterone, both of which will eventually result in an elevation of ACTH and MSH hormones due to the loss of the negative feedback inhibition. So, just to recap the pathophysiology of Addison's disease, it begins because of the damage to the adrenal cortex, the progressive atrophy of the gland, which then in turn causes a deficiency in the cortisol and the aldosterone. The imbalance of these hormones causes deregulation of important body functions that are potentially life-threatening, and this disease manifests itself when 90% of the adrenal gland is destroyed, and in 80% of cases have an autoimmune origin, and 20% result from infection. The first picture that I included is a comparison of what a healthy versus what a not so healthy regulated body looks like. So, if we look at it closely, there is a decreased renin, and then a decreased angiotensin, and then causing in turn an increase of aldosterone. Whereas a healthy body will not have anything decreasing or anything increasing. It will just be regulated normally with the angiotensin and the angiotensinogen and the renin and the aldosterone. The sodium and potassium retention volume overloads and increases the hypertension and increased ARR. The second picture that I wanted to include shows a blood vessel, the histamine and the aldosterone, cortisone and the cortisol, and how in turn the cells are flowing inside this blood vessel, and how these hormones travel through these blood vessels and how they're connected with the adrenocortical cell and the ACTH. Thank you.
Continuing on with the disease summary, let's cover the history of Addison's disease. So, the historical background. Known as one of the founders of modern endocrinology, Thomas Addison, an English physician and scientist, discovered Addison's disease in 1855. Addison first wrote a short article in the London Medical Gazette in 1849, quote, "Anemia, disease of the suprarenal capsules in which the disease is not distinctly separated from a new form of anemia." Then in 1855 came his monograph, one of the unsurpassed medical works of the 19th century, on the constitutional and local effects of disease of the suprarenal capsules, wherein he gave detailed records of 11 patients with tuberculosis, all of whom died with similar clinical symptoms. Here on the left, we have a painting of Thomas Addison, and on the right, the monograph where Addison's findings were first medically published. Now on to the natural history. If left untreated, those with the disease may face the following: gradually decreasing levels of the hormones cortisol, which is primary stress response hormone that increases the glucose in the blood, and aldosterone, which balances the levels of sodium and potassium produced by the adrenal gland. This causes a life-threatening situation called an adrenal or Addisonian crisis. An adrenal crisis is a medical emergency of which the warning signs include severe nausea, confusion, fever, headache, weakness, low blood pressure, low blood levels of sugar, and high blood levels of potassium. If left untreated, it can be fatal. Here we have the crisis pathway of an individual with Addison's disease who is not receiving treatment. It goes through how the life-threatening adrenal crisis sets in after cortisol and aldosterone hormones are low in the body, which causes liver dysfunction and lack of fluids in the kidney, leading to low sugar and fluid volume, vomiting, diarrhea, and cramps, eventually shock, brain coma, and death. Now let's discuss the prevalence of the disease. Addison's disease affects females more than it does males. Approximately 1 in 100,000 people in the United States have Addison's disease. The overall prevalence is estimated to be between 40 and 60 people per million of the general population. Due to the fact that cases of Addison's disease may go undiagnosed, it is difficult to determine its true frequency in the general population. Addison's disease can affect individuals of any age, but it is most common in individuals between 30 and 50 years of age. A study held in 2009 states that the average life expectancy of women with Addison disease is 75.7 years, while for men, it is 64.8 years, which is 3.2 and 11.2 years less than the respective life expectancy in women and men without the disease. Here's a graphic demonstrating the epidemiological measures of prevalence exhibiting the frequency rate, the kinds of people and ages the disease normally affects. Lastly, for the disease summary section, the presentation of the disease. The average percentage of patients exhibit the following presentation of Addison's disease: hyperpigmentation, vitiligo, progressive weakness, fatigue, poor appetite, weight loss, nausea, vomiting, occasional diarrhea, glucocorticoid responsive steatorrhea, dizziness with orthostasis due to hypotension, which may lead to syncope, myalgias and flaccid muscle paralysis may occur due to hyperkalemia, muscle and joint pains, a heightened sense of smell, taste, and hearing, salt cravings, impotence, and decreased libido may occur in male patients, especially those with compromised or borderline testicular function, and female patients may have a history of amenorrhea due to the combined effect of weight loss and chronic ill health or secondary to premature autoimmune ovarian failure. These two pictures showcase the most common presentations of the disease through the prevalence data among those with Addison's. It is clear to see that anorexia, weakness, fatigue, gastrointestinal symptoms such as nausea and vomiting, and hyperpigmentation are the most prevalent, to name a few. Damage that occurs to the adrenal glands is the main cause of Addison's disease. However, there are many other causes that are associated with the disease. For instance, tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection, typically weakens the lungs, but it can also damage over 90% of the adrenal glands' function in the process. Genetic autoimmune disorders can also play a key role in Addison's disease. Some research has shown that people with certain genes are more likely to develop autoimmune disorders and thus more likely to develop Addison's disease. But it is still unclear how the genes that are being studied actually lead to its progression. Rare cases of Addison's disease that run in families support this idea, suggesting that some people may have a genetic predisposition to developing the disease. In the past, tuberculosis was a major contributor in patients that develop Addison's disease worldwide. Now, in approximately 75% of cases, damage to the adrenal cortex results from an autoimmune reaction. Symptoms of Addison's disease appear slowly over time, so they may be confused as other illnesses. Vitiligo, cancer, type 1 diabetes, Cushing's syndrome, or even hypothyroidism are illnesses that can mask as or even lead to the development of Addison's disease. In the United States, Addison's disease typically affects 1 in 100,000 people, but it is most common to appear in people who are 30 to 50 years old. In the diagram, you can see the adrenal glands secrete hormones that help regulate stress and metabolism. The adrenal cortex converts cholesterol into glucocorticoids, also known as cortisol, mineralocorticoids, and androgens, among other hormones. Glucocorticoids regulate body glucose levels, and loss of adrenal cortical function causes a severe aldosterone and cortisol deficiency. In cases such as tuberculosis, the infection infiltrates and slowly destroys the adrenal glands, which results in the development of Addison's disease. Without the essential hormones that the adrenal glands produce, ultimately, typical symptoms of Addison's disease, such as hypotension and dehydration, appear. Because Addison's disease appears slowly over time, vague symptoms such as fatigue, weakness, or weight loss are often overlooked or confused as other illnesses. The initial symptoms of Addison's disease can also include the loss of appetite, low blood pressure, salty food cravings, hyperpigmentation, and nausea. As Addison's disease progresses, it enters a stage known as adrenal crisis. This occurs when the levels of hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland become too low. During adrenal crisis, the symptoms of Addison's disease appear faster and harsher. In this stage, symptoms can include severe dehydration, severe muscle pains and weakness, uneven breaths, severe vomiting, and dizziness. A diagnosis of Addison's disease is made once low blood pressure and hyperpigmentation are confirmed and several other blood tests are taken. If cortisol and aldosterone levels are found to be in extremely low amounts in the blood, this is enough to confirm a diagnosis of Addison's disease. Though a CT scan and an MRI scan of the adrenal glands can be done to confirm. The adrenal glands are located on top of the kidneys and mainly assist the sympathetic nervous system in stress responses. It has two major parts. The adrenal medulla, the inner portion that controls and secretes hormones responsible for the fight or flight response, and the adrenal cortex, the outer portion of the adrenal glands that is responsible for producing sex hormones and regulating salt and sugar balance. With autoimmune disorders, the body's immune system mistakenly recognizes healthy tissue and organs as pathogenic ones and begins attacking them. Antibodies, lymphocytes, and other parts of the immune system are responsible for assaulting the adrenal cortex as if it were foreign to the body. This relentless attack causes damage and degeneration of the adrenal cortex, and it will not cease until treatment is provided. On the rightmost image, you can see a diagram of how normal white blood cells react to healthy tissue in the body. However, on the left, notice how the white blood cells release antibodies and attack the normal tissue cells. These cells engage in a process known as phagocytosis, which is most commonly known as a process of cell death. This mechanism occurs in people who have developed Addison's disease from autoimmune disorders or even by contracting bacterial or fungal infections. On the left, in the top image, you can see the CT scan of someone who has Addison's disease. The orange arrows indicate the position of the adrenal glands. Notice the dark gray color the adrenal glands take. Typically, The adrenal glands take on a light gray color in CT scans, as shown in the bottom CT scan indicated by the black arrows. The different shades of color in CT scans have different meanings. The light gray tone of adrenal glands in the bottom CT scan shows areas of soft tissue or fluids. In contrast, the top CT scan shows clearly distinguishable dark gray matter, which unfortunately indicates air or damage to the adrenal glands.
HLA-DRB1-404, a variation of the HLA-DRB1 disease, is the most well-known risk factor for Addison's disease. Although the mechanism is unknown, this and other illness-associated HLA gene variations are believed to contribute to the improper immune response that leads to Addison's disease. This autoimmune disease is a rare illness in which the two outer layers of the cell in the adrenal glands produce an insufficient amount of steroid chemicals, cortisol and aldosterone. Addison's disease is divided into two categories: primary adrenal insufficiency and secondary adrenal insufficiency. To treat the sickness, your doctor will need to figure out which type is causing your symptoms. What is the disease causing it to not work properly, and how would this work normally? In Addison's disease, your adrenal glands located just above your kidneys produce too little cortisol and often too little aldosterone. Damage to your adrenal glands causes Addison's disease, which results in the lack of the hormone cortisol and, in certain cases, aldosterone. Your endocrine system includes your adrenal glands. Hormones are produced by them, and they give instructions to almost every organ and tissue in your body. There are two portions to your adrenal glands. Adrenaline-like hormones are produced in the interior, the medulla. Corticosteroids are a category of hormones produced by the cortex. The following are examples of corticosteroids. Glucocorticoids are hormones which include cortisol that affect your body's ability to turn food into energy. They play a significant role in the inflammatory response of your immune system and aid in stress response. Mineralocorticoids are hormones which include aldosterone, and they keep the salt and potassium levels in your blood normal. Androgen, both men and women's adrenal glands produce small amounts of these male sex hormones. Androgens, both men and women's adrenal glands produce small amounts of these hormones. They influence muscular mass, libido, and sense of well-being in both men and women. Primary adrenal insufficiency occurs when the cortex is injured and does not produce adequate adrenocortical hormones. This is usually caused by the body attacking itself, which is an autoimmune disease. Your immune system perceives the adrenal cortex as foreign and destroys it for unclear reasons. Addison's disease patients are more likely to have another autoimmune disease than the general population. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is produced by the pituitary gland. The adrenal cortex, in turn, is stimulated to generate hormones by the ACTH. Pituitary tumors, inflammation, and previous pituitary surgeries are all major causes of insufficient pituitary hormone production. Even if your adrenal glands aren't injured, too little ACTH can result in too few glucocorticoids and androgens being produced by your adrenal glands. Secondary adrenal insufficiency is the medical term for this condition. Too little ACTH has no effect on mineralocorticoid production. The majority of secondary adrenal insufficiency symptoms are identical to initial adrenal insufficiency. Secondary adrenal insufficiency, on the other hand, does not cause hyperpigmentation and is less likely to cause severe dehydration or low blood pressure. They have a higher chance of having low blood sugar. Connection to the chemical level organization. Cortisol has numerous other functions in the body, including assisting in proper immune system functions and the breakdown of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. It also helps to maintain blood sugar and cardiovascular function, regulates the amount of water in the body, and plays a role in controlling blood sugar levels by balancing the effects of insulin. Aldosterone regulates sodium and potassium ion imbalance, electrolyte imbalance in the body, as well as water levels, and as a result, blood pressure and blood volume. Low blood pressure is caused by lack of aldosterone, which impairs the kidney's capacity to filter water and salt.
So some of the symptoms for Addison's disease include extreme fatigue, also restlessness and fainting, which could lead to lightheadedness, weight loss and decreased appetite, muscle and joint pains and weakness. It could also lead to depression, irritability, low blood pressure, hypoglycemia, which is low blood glucose, which are sugar levels. There's also body hair loss and craving for salty foods. So these two photos on the slide just show some of those symptoms mentioned. especially on the left photo, it shows the GI symptoms. So you can have diarrhea, abdominal pain, as well as constipation. And then there's the fatigue, the malaise, the weakness. And in the next slide, I'll be talking about the other symptoms that occur. So as mentioned, there could be some penetration in the lower back or the abdomen. You can also have organ failure, including the kidneys, if it's very severe and untreated. You could be sensitive to cold. Also, as mentioned, the diarrhea and the severe vomiting. You could also have high fever and abnormal menstrual cycles. So adrenal insufficiency is also known as Addison's disease. It's just another name for it. And the photo on this slide on the left shows the adrenal insufficiency, as well as an older being on the right side. It is more common in those who are older, which I'll get to later. But that photo also portrays the adrenal crisis if that were to happen, and that's when it gets very severe and untreated. This photo just shows a viewing of the adrenal glands on the right side and then the hyperpigmentation. And then you can also get patches of dark skin around your joints, and you can have scars, as well as the skin folds could have pigmentation as well. And then hypotension can also lead to dehydration. So these are just some symptoms of Addison's disease, aka adrenal insufficiency. So Addison's disease, like mentioned, is also known as adrenal insufficiency, which is AI, and it is a rare case that causes damage to the adrenal glands, in which not enough cortisol or testosterone is produced. The adrenal glands are actually vital to our endocrine system because they produce hormones that give instructions to every tissue and every organ in the body. And then with the insufficiency, the adrenal cortex also does not make enough steroid hormones. So the most common cause of AI is autoimmune disease, in which the body's defense system attacks and destroys the body's own tissues. So therefore, when the adrenal glands are damaged, they won't be able to produce the hormones. And there's also secondary AI, which is secondary adrenal insufficiency. And those problems typically occur with the pituitary gland. And the pituitary's job is to produce ACTH, which tell the adrenal glands to produce cortisol. So if there is not enough ACTH to the adrenal glands, that's also why there is a deficit in cortisol. So the slide before this just shows the hormones, so the testosterone, the cortisol, and the ACTH. And this slide just represents the adrenal glands, so more of a viewing. They sit right on top of your kidneys, and this is just a more clear view on where to locate them. One of the treatments that could be done for Addison's would be blood and urine tests, which check the level of adrenal hormones in ACTH. In this photo, I just included a blood test as well as a urine test. And then I found this interesting chart on the next photo, and it shows the signs and symptoms of Addison's disease and what prevalence percent you have to be to know that you actually have the disease. Another type of treatment could be imaging testing, like ultrasounds, MRI, and X-rays, as shown in this photo, or a CT. A CT could check the size of the adrenal glands and determine if there are abnormalities. MRIs can view the pituitary gland, which would indicate if one has secondary, as mentioned in the previous few slides. And these show all the viewings of how you can identify if you have them. So oral corticosteroids such as hydrocortisone, also known as Cortef, shown on the left side, and then prednisone is also taken, which is shown on the right side. And then the other two types of oral corticosteroids would be methylprednisolone and fludrocortisone acetate, which replaces aldosterone, and the methylprednisolone would also replace the cortisol as well as the Cortef and the prednisone. So this is what is shown in this slide. So for Addison crisis, which would be low blood pressure, low sugar, and high potassium in your body. This is when it's left untreated and it is very severe. You would have to get IV injections, which would include saline, the corticosteroids as well, and then sugar, which is dextrose. So if left untreated, one could experience shocks, seizures, or coma. And in order to fix that, you would have to have plenty of salt, plenty of intake of sodium, and it would have to be consumed in someone's diet, especially during heavily exercising, hot weather, or if you have any GI problems like diarrhea. If you do have vomiting, you would have to have injections of corticosteroids, which would have to be taken into play. I also decided to include future potential treatments that are uprising and still being studied. So researchers are working on developing delayed release corticosteroids, which should more so mimic the human body, as well as the pumps implanted underneath the skin, which could deliver the steroids in more accurate doses. So that is what's shown on the right side, the implant, and then on the left side is the gene therapy, which could also be considered along with using adrenocortical stem cells in combination with immunomodulatory treatment, which modifies the immune response. So with how they address the mechanism, since there is a deficit in cortisol, a corticosteroid would take its place and would have to be taken by mouth 3 times a day. Same with how the adrenal glands produce less testosterone. Fludrocortisone would have to be taken to help regulate the sodium in the body. And then the treatments would help regulate the body to produce hormones in order for the body to stabilize. So on the left side would just be the cortisol, and then on the right side, the photos of different types of corticosteroids you can take to help regulate the body. And lastly, for the prognosis, Addison's affects 1 in 100,000 people. It can affect both men and women in all age groups, but it is more commonly seen in those who are 30 to 50 age range. And most of these people have a normal lifespan, and they can have an active life only with a few limitations. One will have to take medications for the rest of their life to regulate their hormones. So anyone with Addison's or the adrenal insufficiency, they would always have to take medication. And managing bouts of fatigue could also be a factor, as well as other health conditions that could be potential associated with like hypothyroidism or diabetes. Thank you for watching our video. I hope you enjoyed our presentation on Addison's disease.
Thank you so much for watching our presentation on Addison's disease. Here are our references.